So one of the things that is, one of the more tricky things is all of the acronyms. And when you go to a meeting, these terms just fly. And, oftentimes when I'm sitting in a meeting with a parent, I'll stop and say, that means whatever it is, which also takes a lot of time. And you want to spend time working on a school plan. So it's good to literally Google, what are IEP terms that I need to know before you go into a meeting. So you're pretty well versed on things like FAPE, free appropriate public education. What does that mean? That is just what it is, free appropriate public education. And it is what is your right when you have a student in school and with a support plan. LRE is also talked about a lot, least restrictive environment. And I really think that they don't use the acronym for that because school teams always try to say, what is the least restrictive environment? And they put it on a continuum of supports. So you can pretty much see and understand where your student should be on that continuum. And both Erin and I will talk about that a little bit later on with regard to some of the differences between support plans and certainly the difference between a 504 and an IEP. IDEA is the body of laws that is the special education law. LEA is the local educational agent that needs to be at every meeting in order to make decisions and determine the best plan forward. And a 504 is one kind of support plan. There are so many other terms. Some of the ones that I think are the most important are things like AT, assistive technology, which can be anything from a pencil grip, which is low tech, to some kind of iPad application, which would be high tech, or a speech device. Those are all high tech. Post-it notes are low tech. It just depends on, what the technology is. Another one that's really important, or two other ones, is SLD, specific learning disability, comes up a lot. That is the category of eligibility for a learning disability. It can be specific LD dash math, specific learning disability dash, it can be reading, it can be writing. So whatever the area is the specific learning disability. So they don't use the term really dyslexia in eligibility, although someone who has dyslexia would be categorized under specific learning disability dash reading or decoding. And then the other one that's kind of comes up a lot is OHI, other health impairment. And that would be a health, something involving your health. It could be anxiety. It could be, I have one client that I'm working with that has seizure disorder that causes some issues. I have another student who had heart problems that caused missing school and lagging skills. That would be other health impairment. So, I mean, lots of things can be categorized under that. So that's another category that you can certainly investigate more about. Erin and I could both spend like an entire hour on that, but that's the skinny on that. So people often ask, what's the difference between an IEP and a 504? Interestingly enough, today, I had a meeting for a student who went from an IEP to a 504. So I will tell you what it is, and then I'll give you that just as an example of that student support plan. So an IEP is a federal law, and that is an IEP different from a 504, which is a civil rights law, has measurable goals, and you have to become eligible for an IEP plan that has measurable goals with accountability. So you would work through your goal and it would be progress monitored individually for your specific deficit areas, all the way through until you don't need one anymore. IEPs can last only through school age. So it's as long as you're eligible for it, as opposed to a 504, which can last for your whole life. A 504 is different in that it does not have measurable goals. It has accommodations and modifications. It is specifically designed for disabilities that impact life functions, which can be thinking, communication, walking, eating, things like that. So that's, you'll hear a lot of students with 504s who have a disability that, like, they're in a wheelchair, or they have a food allergy, or they have ADHD, they can have ADHD, things like that, that they don't need a specific plan with measurable goals that require services outside of the general education. They can use accommodations and modifications. So here's the scenario that happened today, and you can decide, you'll be the judge. This student is a fourth grader, and has had a support plan for reading, but is now in the 50th percentile for reading. So reading remediation doesn't really need to happen. Last year, he had a fluency goal just to have a maintenance goal and maintain his 50th percentile. He still has difficulty with comprehension some, but not to a degree that would warrant special services. He also has other factors like ADHD. Okay, so reading is an issue, ADHD, he has auditory processing issues, and some comprehension stuff going on. So all of that combined makes him quite vulnerable to slipping below a certain point where he would need specialized support, which he's been getting up until now. So the determination was made to give him a 504 plan. The argument could be made, a 504 plan will accommodate some of these skills, some of these poor skills that need skill building. So for example, because of his auditory processing, he doesn't often initiate tasks quickly and needs the instructions once again in order to initiate tasks. In the observation report, it said that every time he started something, the teacher had to go over and show him how to initiate. That would lead me to believe that he needs a measurable goal for task initiation. So it was clarified that it was like a group project and a group member was missing. So that was what, there's always some kind of reason and extenuating circumstances, but you would have to think through, is this something that he just literally needs a reminder or someone to say, what do you think you need to be doing? And then he'll say and initiate, or does he need a pull out or a specialized instruction to be able to skill build in that area? So that's kind of the difference. A lot of times it's like accommodations are sitting in the front of the room or extended time. So you have to think, for anxiety, for ADHD, is this going to support, is this really going to make a difference? If I sit in the front of the room, am I just going to have ADHD in the front of the room, or is it going to help me? If I have extended time because I get anxious and need more time, is it just, I'm going to be anxious twice as long, or is this really going to help me think through, am I going to be able to read the questions with more time and not be as anxious? So you really have to think through what would work best for your student and whether or not they need measurable goals with accountability to get there. In this particular case, it was clear that this fourth grade boy, he would be the highest one in the pullout, and he would not be able to access higher vocabulary, text complexity in that pullout group, which he probably is ready for and needs. But he also needs these other, he probably could have used, arguably a goal for task initiation and follow through and things like that. So we settled on a 504 with a tracking system, which is a unique idea. And I think it's probably going to work for him. We'll see. So timelines for IEPs, and you can Google all of these again. And so just briefly, when you request an evaluation for to determine eligibility for special education, the school has 14 days to get back to you on that. So you're saying, I think something's going on. I would like my child evaluated. They can say yes, they can say no, but they have 14 days to do it. Once they say yes, if they say yes, then a domains meeting is held, which I'll explain in a minute. But once those domains are signed off on, then the school has 60 school days. This is why whenever parents call me and they say, well, I'm not sure, I don't know, maybe, I say, you know what, go ahead and put your paperwork in, because they're either going to say yes or no, but the time starts ticking. And if you have 60 days from today, that would be the end of school, the school days. So they have a calendar to figure out, holidays and weekends and this and that. And, you're looking at the end of school if you today put in a request for, for an evaluation. Then you can hold it. If you have an IEP, you can hold an IEP anytime you want. So let's say tonight you're realizing things are not going well. You would put in a request for an IEP and the school has 10 calendar days to get back to you on when they can schedule that. You can have a reevaluation every year. It's not a great idea to do it every year. You can do it every year, but no more than once a year. And certainly it is required every 3 years. So depending on what a student's issue is, for example, in my own case, my son, who was profoundly dyslexic, I needed to make sure that there was growth, which there often wasn't. So I did a reevaluation every 2 years. And then certainly after an IEP is put into place, there are time limits of, when services need to begin. And then how long you can wait before signing documents before that needs to happen. So depending on when you sign. Okay, who is in the IEP meeting? So all of these people need to be in the meeting. The special education teacher to talk about what supports parents who are part of the team, a gen ed teacher who is able to speak on what gen ed kids are doing. So they often, say, okay, so your student is in a foundational English class, but what do they do in the regular, freshman year English class? What are they reading? What is the rigor of the assignment? So you can compare it to what your student may be doing if they are in a special education classroom with supports. The LEA needs to be there in order to either take notes and make educational team decisions. The psychologist is there to talk about the evaluation or any kind of documentation data. That data is what determines supports, and then the child is really in the center. So for high school students, it's often the team likes to have the student there. A lot of parents choose to have the student there for the first 10 minutes and then leave, or for the last half of the meeting. If you really have some tricky things to talk about, you really want to think about your particular child's situation. Is it going to cause them anxiety to be sitting there while the plan is being negotiated, while you're talking about things that may upset them or upsetting to you as a parent? And while that's going on, you may or may not want your child sitting there. So that's a determination that you and the team can make together. So the process is, once you feel like there may be an issue, or the school alerts you that there may be an issue, you would begin the evaluation process. That starts with a domains meeting where you review all of the domains and domains are areas. So those are things like vision, hearing, motor, social, emotional, communication, academics, functional, and Erin, am I missing anything else? I don't know. I think I got them all.
No, I think you got all the boxes. I was going to say the functional box was the one I was looking for.
So you look at each of those domains and you might say, vision, hearing, we did those tests, they're good. Communication, do they have articulation issues or do they have pragmatic, some kind of, receptive, expressive language? If they don't, you don't need to open that domain. Most of the other ones you likely would open in an evaluation. Academics, you may or may not. Functional, probably. Social, emotional, probably. Just to determine if supports are needed in those other areas. Sometimes if a kid has a learning disability, they might, a school team might say, well, they don't have any social emotional. We're not seeing that. But if you're seeing it at home, you might say, you know what? I noticed that they, pick their nails till they bleed. I'm worried about anxiety. I know you might not have noticed that at school, but because they put their hands like this or, whatever, but I think that that's anxiety. Do we need to open that domain and look at something like supports for something like that?
Can I chime in on that exact fact? I would just say anecdotally, and it's not going to surprise anybody on the call, that in the last 2 years, we have seen more students who are indicating in some way that's like what you said, like almost like a passive an anxiety, like a twitch or like and we're seeing that and we are seeing it because they are aware. I work at the high school. They are starting to be aware that they feel behind in their peers. And so we have really encouraged the teams and everyone to be on board with doing the social emotional when it comes to initial IEP meetings, because kids are just manifesting that anxiety and showing us in different ways. And it's been a little atypical to what we normally would have looked at in terms of data to say there's a social emotional impact, but we're seeing it come up in different ways. So I really appreciate that you highlighted that.
Yeah, and I think especially if your student is in a high school or middle school where they see multiple teachers, one teacher may see it and one teacher may not. If they're very comfortable in, science class, but when they're writing, they're chewing on their sleeve or they're, whatever it is, that, and there are ways to support learners through that. So I agree with Erin that it's something that is coming up a lot. So once the domain paperwork is signed, then the evaluation begins, and it's really to look at present levels of performance. So it's not just academic performance, it can be functional performance. So I have a high school client who he is probably has, I think he's got a 130 something IQ, but he has very low executive functioning. So academically, like he doesn't really have and will not show any issues academically, but functionally, he's got a lot of issues. In fact, so many issues that his highest grade was a 21%. So if IQ wise, he's off the charts, but functionally cannot initiate tasks, can't follow through, sustained attention. Those are all functional performance. So that doesn't, that will impact your academics. So that's why, you're really looking at these different areas. And so once you have all that data, that will drive the goals that will drive the instruction. So then they'll, recommend different goals in the deficit areas based on the present levels. And then that's what drives the instruction. So in order to prepare for these meetings, it's important that you ask for all draft documents in advance that they can share with you. Sometimes they cannot share with you, if it's an initial IEP, they might not share with you a draft of an IEP because eligibility has not been determined yet. And they could, be in trouble for predetermining because it's really a team decision. Although some teams, if it's very clear that your student is going to have an IEP, sometimes they will say, hypothetically, we're going to give you this draft so you can be ready for the meeting. And if not, and you get a draft IEP at the meeting and you have never seen it before, it is within your right to say, I really want to have time to go over this. Can we schedule a second meeting? It's the only problem is, meetings take a lot of time and require coordination and scheduling. But it is within your right, and it's advisable if you have a lot of things you want to review, because the last line, the last bullet point on this is really the language is, parents are required to have meaningful parent participation. And if you do not feel like you're able to meaningfully participate, which is gray, that can mean lots of different things, then you are able to stop that meeting and call another meeting. You can also ask for work samples. You can bring in homework that you have seen the student do. If you feel like what they're doing at school is discrepant from what they're doing at home and you're wondering, you can bring in questions. I always write questions in advance. The idea is to partner with the school team and to be transparent. We're not trying to surprise school teams. We're not trying to catch them. And we're not trying to create a situation where it would be defensive for any reason. We're trying to figure out, how do we make a plan, the most appropriate plan for this student, and move forward from there with the team, because they're the ones that are seeing your student all day. And then, once you get an IEP plan, it will have measurable goals in it. And they're called SMART goals because they need to be all of these things: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time limited. So I was thinking of examples of 2 goals that I was going to share, but now they went out of my mind. But things like you really have to think about, and then this is what, Erin, this is what we were talking about earlier. You have to think about what you want your student to be able to do and how much growth you want to see them make. So, and a very just, easy example to share would be like in kindergarten, an end of the year goal would be that the student is able to read and write numbers to 100. That's a kindergarten goal for the end of the year. So if your student is not counting yet, it is probably not attainable for them to, by February, this is February, write a goal for today to get to where the other kids will be. So how do we make that goal attainable, but also how do we make it ambitious enough? So, if the school team says, well, we're going to do 1 to 5, and because they're getting like 1 to 3 right now, so we'll just do 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Well, I would say, you know what, let's make it a little bit more ambitious. Let's go to 50. Let's try before the end of the year to go to 50. That would mean that instead of pulling the student twice a week for 30 minutes for math, we may need to pull the student every day for math. So the rigor is really going to play a role in this. And Erin and I were talking about this. So I hear often that school teams say, and I just use the kindergarten example because it's pretty black and white. That can be the same with, any kind of reading goals. It can be the same with social emotional goals, with speech goals. It can be really be for anything. How do you put the rigor in there? Make it specific, make it measurable, make it so they can attain it, and with specific time on it. So I often hear goals are fluid. We could change them at any time. We're not just teaching this skill. We're doing lots of things. So, like a math goal might be that they, are adding and subtracting within, double digits. Well, if the other kids are doing it triple digits, then how do we get there faster? Do we need, or how do we close that gap? So if goals are fluid, then we want to make it more rigorous, and we can change that. So Erin, what do you have to say about things like that too?
Yeah, I think from someone who I sit in on the teams while we talk about goals, and when you first said that you hear teams saying goals are fluid, it didn't sit well with me because I thought to me my initial concern is sitting on that team is we're not just keeping moving the mark, is the student actually attaining what we set to begin with? And so I don't want to, I like the word fluid didn't sit well with me because fluid applies to me that we can move the mark. And I
Right.
would rather have a spot where we feel good about the integrity of us making that mark. And if we're not, we have the targeted conversation as how to not. So you talked about maybe we need pull out twice a week, and that's one of those conversations where the goal has to be the same because otherwise we may be clouding what progress the kid isn't making. So I didn't love that teams use that word. And if I was with my team, I would probably break that down. Like, what are you really trying to say? Are you
Right.
saying we can modify them as a team because that sounds different to me than you saying it's fluid because I would be concerned the school is just moving the mark.
Interesting. So, I'm also thinking of a balance for this. So we also don't want to, I have certain situations where if you make a goal too rigorous, it might cause dysregulation in a student. So if it's too much for them at any level, any grade, it could frustrate them. So you really want to have a balance between something that is rigorous, that feels good, and it feels like it's supportive enough. So that's really something to negotiate with the team and to think about.
And that makes me think of how important, and I'll talk about it too, but that meaningful participation, because I think it is, we want students to grow, and we all know we grow when we get to a point of discomfort, right? And we know that that's part of that, but everyone has to be acutely aware of when that child is indicating to us that they're getting overwhelmed or that we're doing something or we're pushing them too hard. And there'll be, like you said, ways that may come out at the school that may not be coming out at home, or that anxiety may come out at home and that frustration may come out. And if we're not in good communication, we could miss that.
Yeah. So, I want to give a couple of examples of some, I know we had some, it was a split between, we had, all grades on here, but I also wanted to talk about, because this is grid as a group for teens, and Erin's at the high school level. So I also wanted to talk about some goals that, I see in high school, and why you would or would not have them. Oftentimes, younger students need reading goals to support decoding, or encoding, the partner skill, which is spelling. So, certainly remediation in the younger grades for reading is, where what many of the goals look like. But as you move into late middle school and high school, the return on investment of using a structured literacy program, which I like, being a literacy person myself, it sometimes, the pullout and working through a structured literacy might not be, depending on the student, the best use of time. At that point, or at what point would you switch to more compensatory? So working less on the decoding piece, more on, you can have, an assistive technology advocacy goal, so that they understand and are able to use technology in order to listen to, audio and comprehend at a certain percent. So there are goals that look like that too, where they, like, this is with my own personal child too. He, was not reading in, seventh, eighth, like, he really struggles with decoding, but I wanted to make sure that he had the skill to comprehend by listening to grade level text, listening to text. And so his goal shifted from a decoding goal to a comprehension goal so that he could leverage that skill. So, when he graduated, he is a freshman in college. And when he graduated last year, his comprehension was super high, but he still isn't a reader. And that's his profile. That's not every kid's profile, but so he did not have reading goals pretty much in high school, because He really had comprehension for, listening, and he had technology goals with regard to writing, including mechanics and spelling, so that he was very, very efficient and proficient at using technology. So, I advocated that he should, if he's using technology, should have zero spelling mistakes. Oftentimes as an accommodation, it will be, we don't count off for spelling. Well, that's accommodating a poor behavior that's really not okay. Because when you go to your first job and you write your cover letter and it has 5 misspelled words, your boss is not going to say, oh, I know you had an IEP and they accommodated poor spelling, so that's okay, we're just going to hire you anyway. That's not going to happen. So his, part of his goal was that his spelling would be at 95% accuracy. I really wanted it to be 100, but I gave him the 5%. So anyway, you get what I'm saying. So goals change, they shift depending on deficit areas, data, and need. How do you know if your student is making progress? You can ask for communication reports as often as you need. I think it's, not a great idea to, in today's meeting, when there was the tracking of the 504 put into place, we talked about how that's going to be tracked. It's not a great idea to have, daily communication on that. That's too much for a teacher to have to do. Weekly communication is probably okay. Could be a little too much. Maybe, twice a month, depending on what you need. You can ask for it, but certainly it is mandated 3 times a year that you can see this progress, and that should be progress towards goals. And then this is my last slide, just to really briefly review, because this is something that every parent really should know going into meetings about the Andrew F. case that's kind of governs the special education law. So it changed in 2017 with this case of this student, Andrew F. So his nickname is Drew, and he had autism. He had some behavior issues. Lots of learning things. And the school felt like his goals were the same from year to year, and he was just being moved along from year to year. Long story short, they put him in another school, private, unilaterally placed him. While they went through the court system, they moved him back. He did very well in the private school for kids with autism. Then they moved him back. And again, the school system just kept moving him along from grade to grade, but they weren't seeing this, meaningful progress, in his situation. So it went through the court system all the way through to the Supreme Court, through circuit and appellate courts to the Supreme Court. And what they decided is that in order to provide children with disabilities the FAPE, free appropriate public education, that this, IDEA has guaranteed for students, the school must offer children an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable each child to make progress appropriate for that child's circumstance. So fortunately and unfortunately, this is so gray, because you can argue either side of that. Did they make what is reasonable progress, and what is appropriate for that child and their circumstance? So it enabled parents to be able to say, we want something different, and you cannot move my child from grade to grade. But it also allows school teams to talk about what is reasonable progress, calculated by their retention, by their ability to attend in class, things like that. So it's, something that really needs a lot of discussion and a lot of partnership with the school.
All right, thank you. So I have the next block of slides for the evening focused on really working with the school teams. And so I just wanted to start by sharing a couple graphics that govern how schools respond to needs that come up with the students within our walls. And I want to reiterate what Shira said. When you have questions or concerns, reach out. Early collaboration is key. One of the questions that was submitted when Grit set out the form was, how do you know when to request a plan? That when you have a concern, start asking questions. And then there should be collaboration between you and the school in response to those questions that give you insight as to when maybe what is being provided isn't enough. And so the first graphic that you'll see with the little umbrella. So MTSS, that is multi-tiered systems of support. So every school in school district is required to have a variety of ways that we respond to the needs of students in our building. So it's been acknowledged that it's a one size fits all model doesn't work for everybody, right? So we have to come up with ways to respond to the differences and the uniquenesses of the students who join us. So one of the things that I put then out in the larger graphic, the triangle, is really important when we're talking about 504s and IEPs, because those are specific individualized plans that fit within the larger structure of response to intervention. That's what RTI is, response to intervention, that we have to have when students are struggling. So that tier one, that bottom part of that triangle, those would be school-wide interventions that are available to everyone. So I'm going to have a model student who is struggling academically in reading class and then in a health class. So that's what we see. RTI, tier one, would be what is available to that student no matter what. Any student is able to get access to those things to help them in their courses. And so underneath that, that also includes instructional strategies that the school focuses on. You know, what are the assessment policies that exist for all children in the building, what tutoring opportunities exist. We at the school I'm at, we have content area tutors. And so we have a math, English, social studies teacher all throughout the day that are available. So those are tier one supports. Any student can get those regardless of whether or not they're struggling or not. But when we start to see a student who is accessing those tier one supports, they're getting what we can guarantee at all levels for all students, and we're still starting to see needs pop up, we're seeing a reason for concern. Then we move up into that tier one, or that tier two, I'm sorry. So what is the next level of support? So if we have a student who we're starting to see that they're struggling in health class, but then they're also struggling in that English class, one of the tier two supports that would be offered would be, hey, we see this grade data come in, the counselor's going to meet with that student and talk about, can we get you involved in an academic group? How are your organizational skills? Where do you feel like you're struggling? Because we have things like academic small groups that we put students in. So that's a little bit more, I guess, a smaller intervention, a more targeted intervention for that student. And we work to put those into place. And then if we start to see that those tier two interventions aren't providing enough support for that student to start doing well in those classes, performing on grade level, we start to see them slipping behind, then we would move into the problem solving area where the 504s and the IEP lives. So our tier three plans, and tier three, in terms of how schools talk about that, that includes a number of different things. That would also include times when we look at like alternative education settings for students. So it is more restrictive. We have smaller amounts of students that need those levels of plans. But we also, as a school, because of least restrictive environment, which you talked about earlier, we have to have tried all of these different ways to get your students those supports that don't exclude them from other opportunities. So one example is we have a couple support classes in the district that I work in at D99, but those support classes take away an hour during the day. And so if a student has shown that we have like different assessment tests that would show a need for a support class, if we are going to take an hour out of your day to put you in a support class, then there should be data monitoring that that's being effective. And eventually you should no longer need that. And you should be in a less restrictive environment and have access to different electives and things like that. And so really that triangle keeps schools honest as to when we were putting in interventions in place. It also helps us be systemic in how we're thinking. So there's a system to how we're determining how we're supporting different students. So you can click to the next slide. All right, so what should I ask the support team? Or I think, can you go back one? I think I took what steps. Yes, there we go. So another question was, what steps should I take if I think I need this plan? First step would be to reach out to your student support team. And if you don't know who that is, I would say that I think at DGN, we push out who the support teams are. The word alpha team is heard from the second year and eighth grader. But if you don't know, because sometimes we think we push things out and it's not in a workable way for parents to access when they have a need. So you should start with the support services staff at your school. So I know that elementary schools, middle schools do have counselors and social workers. You may not have an alpha team model, but reach out to that person there or your child's teacher. But in terms of getting the conversation rolling with the RTI team, I would always suggest your support service team. And if you don't hear back, which unfortunately does sometimes happen, never hesitate to get an administrator involved, merely to ask the question on how to get your questions answered. And so I never am taken aback when someone reaches out because they need support getting connected to the right places. So I would encourage parents not to overthink reaching out to get connected. I hear sometimes parents saying they didn't want to be that parent. They thought they were asking too many questions. And I like to assure people, you're in it for your kid, and I want to be in it with your kid for you. So I'm not going to respond to you poorly if you reach out to ask questions. So I would always say first step is to reach out, find out where the processes lie. Okay. Then the next. So what should you ask? So you notice your child is struggling. You notice that they're up late at night. This is one that's been really interesting. If we find that the students have been coming back from the pandemic, our study habits are off kilter. And we have some students who are really internalizing a lot of academic anxiety. So you notice something at home, your parent spidey senses tingle. And what should you ask the team then when you reach out for more information? I would always recommend asking about what the supports the schools do provide as part of that intervention structure. What is available to your students that maybe they're not coming home and telling you about when they are coming home from school? Where are their tutors? Are there small groups they can get involved in? At the elementary school, what kind of clubs or pull-out groups or other things exist that you may not have to have a 504 IEP for? Now, when you start talking about things like pull-out groups, I'm going to say there's probably limited access that you would have to that without a plan, just because of the way personnel work. But you should ask, see what interventions already exist, and then ask for what the approval process is at the school. I've worked at 2 different schools. I was an intern at one, and those are different processes. And so who you go to and how. Ask where that team exists. And so the first thing underneath that is the RTI team. So when people come together to review the case, so if you've put in a request for an evaluation, then the school's RTI team will come together and review that request. We will review data that we have at our disposal. And so that often includes things like attendance, grades, assessment, progress monitoring, teacher reports. But we also will review information that you have. And so the idea of sharing any documents you have, work samples you have, welcome all of that, because the student doesn't exist just in the school setting. And the RTI teams will get together and look at those documents, supporting documents that you provide. Also, we've started to get neuropsych evaluations more often, which is really helpful when we're looking for what kind of testing the school then should do to supplement or dig deeper into some of the things in that testing. So if you're comfortable sharing those kind of documents, they are very helpful for the school. And then that school will look at all that comprehensive picture of your student. I sit in on the team at the school I'm at with the social workers and the psychologists and the counselors. And we look at that case. We determine if at this time a tier 3 plan, so an IEP or a 504, is appropriate or not, or needed. And then we would report that back to the parent. Every school does have an appeal process. And so in that initial process, if your plan is denied, there is a way that you could ask what that appeal process is, if you'd like to bring another set of eyes on that or submit more documentation. If we are in a spot where, at least with the team I lead, if we're in a spot where we are denying a plan and we're saying that we don't see a substantial impact to the educational environment at this time, I work with that team to try to make sure that we're always going back and saying, and we are going to keep an eye on these particular areas for the next 4 weeks, and we're going to monitor. Because if we are coming to the table, then there is a reason to monitor, and there is a reason for concern. And so those would be the questions that I would recommend. And I saw something in the chat. Let's see. Okay, I will answer that here at the end. Okay. We can go to the next slide. So just a couple quick facts before we hit the questions and sign out tonight. So I know that Shira mentioned the term modifications and accommodations are often used in schools to discuss the different support plans. And so a modification, so when I'm speaking to a modification, we're talking about modifying curriculum. We're talking about changing things in the instruction. So modifications can be on a 504 plan, but often if we are looking at a 504 plan that is asking for curricular modifications, we will also then have the discussion as to, but does this require specialized instruction? So kind of like the 4th grader with the reading kind of conversation you're talking about, are we going to limit their access to rigorous curriculum if we modify it? So are there accommodations that are actually more appropriate? And so we will find the word accommodation around 504 plans a bit more, because then we're talking about how can we accommodate this environment to provide this student equal access to this general education curriculum. And so you'll hear those things a little bit differently. But both plans, regardless, should be data supported and monitored. As a parent, you can request progress updates. I would say we have a system, and I don't know what the data system is in all the different schools, but our data system allows for parents to be able to access child's grade book and things like that. And so there's access to that data, but if you're wanting anecdotal data, I would say probably twice a month would be what I would start with. But then if we had concern, if we were monitoring certain skills that we were checking on, I'd be happy to work with teams to have a more frequent communication. But a lot of our teachers also do weekly updates anyway, where they push out grades to teachers. But I'm always happy to look on that. And you're a part of that data team, so you should feel comfortable with the frequency that you're receiving that data. And then one of the questions that someone passed along was, are schools reluctant to provide these plans? And I'm so glad someone asked that question, because this is one of the touch points with parents and sometimes school teams where things do get kind of tense, because everybody is coming to the table and believing they are advocating for what is best for that student. And sometimes we are seeing things differently and advocating for different things. And the one thing I would ask, or at least I would ask as a school administrator, is that we remember that the schools must support your child in the least restrictive environment. And so I had a really interesting conversation with a parent a few years ago who was asking for pull out one-on-one testing. And we didn't have a lot of data to show that that was the first step to go to. You know, it was an early student who had just been diagnosed with ADHD. We were having some trouble finishing tests on time. And so the team had come with a recommendation of, well, let's try extended time. We'll work to figure out what that looks like in the different content areas. And the parent really felt like they needed to be one-on-one proctored testing in another setting. And so we had a really good, spicy, but good conversation around the least restrictive environment, and to pull your child out of that environment away from that teacher. One-on-one in another setting is actually pulling them farther from that gen ed environment. So do we really want to do that, or do we feel like this would actually work for the student? And for this student, it did. Once this young lady got a hold of what her process was to request extended time, where she was going to go take it, how she was going to ask questions, it really, really helped. And then she ended up that small accommodation, I do believe it was like the only thing on the plan, relieved the anxiety that she was feeling that was coupled with the ADHD that she was also working through as a young person being diagnosed with. But when we were coming to the table, that parent really felt like that was the safest, most discreet environment for their child, right? And so it was a good conversation because we were able to talk about that. So there should always be continued conversations on the success of those interventions. And when we have a student who maybe starts in 9th grade with a 504, a lot of the times we're getting a draft of that from a different school. And we have to work on language changes, because that plan from middle school may say something like, student will check in with academic advisor 3 times a week. When you come to the school to Downers Grove, there isn't an academic advising system where someone checks in with 3 times a week. So what is that intervention? What need is that intervention accommodating for? And then what can we put in place? And then how can we make sure it's successful? I like to throw out when we're having plans about putting accommodations on or taking off, or someone asked about medication. So if your student is doing really well on medication, how do you ensure that that plan's still ready to support them? My time frame that I always says, like, 3 to 6 weeks, we should be checking in. If we are taking accommodation off because we feel like a student is being successful with a mitigating measure like medication, we should have eyes on if that's really panning out the way we thought it would 3 weeks and 6 weeks. Because medication is tricky. And we could start off with that doing one thing and then it doesn't sustain. And so you would have to put in steps to figure that out. We also would look to modify the child's plan as needed. And so one of the most interesting meetings that we hold are the senior meetings, because we can see kind of what students came with and they needed to get the building blocks into that equal education, but they've just grown and learned and modified as learners. And so sometimes the senior plans are a little smaller because there are certain things like providing copies of notes. That student who had ADHD may have figured out their technique for taking notes and so no longer need that teacher copy. So the accommodation ends up being can request copy of notes, right? And so then we are modifying that as it meets the needs of your kids. And I think one more slide, maybe. Oh yeah. So we want to take a minute to let you think about what you can apply from the information from today. And then I'm going to go through real quick on these questions and see if there's anything we didn't touch on, and then Shira, you can jump in. Let's see, the school. Okay. So one question is, and I'd be interested in your feelings on this. How do you ensure that your child is not being picked on through the IEP or the 504 process? So how does that process, what I'm gleaning from that question is, how does the process of a 504 IEP interact with students who may be having some social concerns or maybe in a bullying type situation? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I am muted. I get the bullying question a lot. So like, was it last week? I got a question about why would my daughter's teacher put her, I keep saying that they need to be separated because there's other kids bullying her. Why would she put them in a group together? How do we get them separate? I want this, I want that. So, my standard answer is, you know, I can't do anything about that other kid if you're calling me. I don't know that other kid, I don't know their parent. And so what I can do is figure out what supports we can do for your student. So first thing, who is their go-to person? Who is their person that they can go to at school, and a pyramid of support? So like, first I go to this person. If they're not there, then I go to this person, then I go to this person. Also, how can I practice, self-advocacy skills? So what do I need to practice? How can I interact with this other person? Or how can I not interact with this person? So that's going to also depend. I do get a lot of questions about the teacher doesn't notice, or the teacher won't do anything, things like that. So depending on the kid and their age, it really does come down to what they, how they can seek support, and what they need to practice in terms of, if you are, 6, how do you practice going to your teacher and reporting something that's bothering you and why? You can use visuals, you can use social story. I mean, there are a ton of different ways to do that. Or if they're older, what are the supports that are there? How do you practice navigating that with other peers? How can you have collaborative conversations? How can you problem solve? How can you think flexibly? What about perspective taking? Those are all the buzzwords that come together with bullying. So
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, absolutely. At the level that I've worked at in the middle school, it's been interesting because we see this is happening. And so when I look at it from an administrative standpoint, there should be a whole discipline process that is responding to what is going on with the irrational harassment, picking on students that exists. But then under the IEP 504, we're talking interventions for your particular student. That should really be focused on what you had just said. How are we helping them emotionally with that's going on? Because there's a lot of struggle, and so I would say kids are struggling socially right now. A girl said to me, getting kicked off the lunch table is the new bullying. Like that social exclusion, that has an emotional impact. And so if your student happens to have minutes on their IEP from working with a social worker, how are we communicating with their social worker to help that student work through what is happening socially and gain some skills? And then through the discipline avenues, we need to be responding to things that cross the line, things that are harassment. How do we empower them to bring those things forward? Because there's also social risk there, and really supporting students. But I think if your student does have an IEP or 504 and you are having issues, the IEP team, your case manager, the counselor, the people who are sitting at that table when they're building that, those should be people that you can go to with advocacy to help you come up with a plan to support your student through those social struggles. And also be an advocate for them when you go to the dean. That's scary too. So who can help advocate them and get them where they need to be? Let's see. So with all of the laws that we covered at the beginning, I had a question that said, how likely have you found school districts to really care about students when they're at the table and not just be concerned about getting hauled off to court? That was a question I received. I would say that I think that one of the things that combats students only being numbers is who's at the table. It is difficult to have conversations that are only focused on avoiding litigation when you have real live humans at a table in front of you. I'm wired that way, I will say. Could never see myself working in education outside of a school building because I'm not spending times with family, students, and staff. It's a very human industry. And so I think when you get together and you're collaborating around what someone needs, it does humanize it. Even though it can get tense, like I said earlier, tension brings growth. And we all need to come to the table and feel comfortable with that voice. Shira, I don't know if you feel any different about that, or if you sat on any other contentious meetings.
That's really one of the main reasons why in advance I always share questions, because as an advocate, I get all the time. Well, if I hire you and bring you to a meeting, isn't that going to make the school team mad? Aren't they going to bring a lawyer, or aren't they, isn't it going to change things? Aren't they going to retaliate on me? And I'm like, no, that's not my experience, and that's not the way I work. So that's why I send questions in advance. I don't want any surprises. I'm not in the business of trying to catch anybody doing anything. What I am trying to do is, focus on how do we help this kid. Look, I will go to bat for students. And if a school team, if I feel like they've dropped the ball or didn't notice something or needs to, they are accountable for something, I will say it. But I'm also going to, be very fair in terms of, you can't ask for things that the kid doesn't need or shouldn't have also. And I think, those things have to be navigated. I mean, I have had some pretty strange situations where, you have to go by what the law says and you have to support students. And sometimes it's gray. So, that's what I can say about that.
Yeah. And I joke that I kind of like conflict. I have a lot of background in conflict resolution. I think that we have to talk about uncomfortable things. So that my husband's laughing somewhere in the other room because I'm sure he heard me say that. But I also think that when we're coming together, and if the meetings do get spicy, that's usually the adjective I use. If the meeting gets spicy and we're starting to disagree, I also think it's important to name, I feel like we're getting frustrated. And and so what do we need to do to reset? I know you said we can call another meeting. If we don't feel like we're communicating adequately around the needs of the student and the objective at hand, we have to humanize that space and say, because there are occasions we will disagree but we all have to come together to work with what's best for the kid. Another question. So if a teacher notices that a preschooler is delayed and this is not apparent in a screening, what do you recommend parents do to get support at school? We don't do a lot of screeners at the high school level. My systemic answer to that is if the teacher notices, I would wonder how the teacher and parent could pair in doing within that system where that teacher works to get another type of screener.
Yeah, I mean, I am actually working on state legislation on literacy screeners, and Erin has reviewed our bill, given us her feedback. So, there are a lot of screeners that cover the basic area. This is literacy I'm referring to. So there are other screeners out there, but there's some basic screeners that are pretty good. There's free ones. I think that you really can, if you find a deficit area, I would align it to a particular intervention, because then you'll know. If it's not picking it up on the screener, but you see something and you put into place an intervention for that deficit area, the kid will either pick it up quickly or it'll be picked up on a screener the next time you do it. So seems to be like that's the way to go. But look, you can also certainly, for preschoolers, even get an outside evaluation, see what they see. I mean, that's always, if you can afford to do that or have the time, that's always an option too.
Absolutely. Next question, what can be done if a student is not a native speaker and has basic English, but also has an LD diagnosis?
Yeah, that's, that is a lot of what we're encountering with our legislation in terms of, are we putting kids who, just because they don't speak English well enough, into special education? Really, again, it's the same thing. If you have a person who is not a native English speaker and you provide some kind of screening or assessments that show that they have a learning disability, there are nuanced tests like rapid naming. You can do it in the language of, in their native language. It is best to do many of these in the language of instruction. But then if they don't have an LD, they again will pick up these skills very fast, move right back out. They will not stay in the LD special education phase. The prevalence of a learning disability is the same in every, regardless of what language you speak. So like dyslexia, 1 in 5 people are dyslexic. That's the same if you speak Spanish, if you speak Russian, if you speak Urdu, it doesn't change just because you speak another language. So the student who speaks Russian, who just came to the school, you wouldn't give them a screener. You would wait until they reach a certain proficiency, give them a screener, and then determine what interventions and supports they need, if any. If they do need them, you put that into place. Are they responding? How fast are they responding? What's their retention rate? Then you're going to know. If they pick it up quickly, yeah, we wanted them to have a little bit more skills, a little bit more support. Great, we did it. Now they're out, they're done. Or, you know what? They have some kind of a LD. There's something else going on here. Maybe we don't do a screener, we do more assessments to determine, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's that area, those touch points between English language learners and our special services is an area we can always do better, because we've gotten, I think, a few more. I've had more conversations around students who are refugees or students who have come from out of country who have not been in American schools for a while. And so it's been interesting to try to, with an older student, find the right ways to do those assessments. We don't have them in as many languages as I wish we did. And so, but because you're in high school, any time that we're not getting credit toward graduation then becomes troublesome. And so we can grow there. We're actually doing some work with one of the district administrators around that. We're always talking about how do we help strengthen the supports that exist, things in native languages, fluency and agency among parent groups, and just make sure people understand what supports are available and we're doing the right one. So, next question.
I think we had a live question. Somebody to raise their hand. You could just unmute yourself and ask it.
I'm actually following up my question about the student who's not an English speaker. The problem, I got your answer and thank you so much. The problem is they cannot be assessed because of their English level. And the diagnostic test and that
I think we lost them. I will say to that point, there are tests that can be done. For example, rapid naming. Also, I mean, some of the screeners. So here's an example that we used in discussing this with regard to our bill. So Erin, you're going to be my student. I happen to speak Hebrew. So I'm going to give you a Hebrew word and I'm going to ask you for the first sound that you hear in that word. The word is Kelev. What's the first sound you hear in Kelev?
Kelev, I hear a K or like a C, but a K.
Okay, so you would say K. Okay. Kelev is dog. Now I'm going to do it in English. What's the first sound you hear in dog?
Duh.
Right. So she got it right in both languages. Amazing. And she doesn't speak Hebrew. So as soon as you get the instructional piece, you get the, and they understand what to do. And you can do that in a variety of ways with pictures or things, when they understand it, then something like that, at least for literacy, you can do. You can also do it with, rapid naming, which is a big predictor of an LD or certainly a reading disability. Can be also, math if they're, not rapid naming quickly. Automaticity. You can do the same with, any pictures in any language or colors in a language. So those are all, I think you have to, school teams need to be creative and think out of the box on certain of those assessments. They actually are creating assessments in many other languages. Today, I had a meeting with someone who has a Spanish, some assessments only in Spanish that Amplify, which is someone who does assessments in English. So they now are rolling out all of their Spanish assessments. So
yeah, that's great. I hope we keep building our library in that.
Yeah, and it's not just for Spanish students. I mean, 74% of the English language learners in Illinois happen to speak Spanish, but we have just about 25% of people who don't. And also Illinois is the fifth largest, has the fifth largest population of non-native English speakers. So it's something that we really need to focus on in our state.
Absolutely. We have a resource where we can make phone calls. It's called Language Line. And we have translation for Spanish, but we have such a wonderful wealth of other languages, but I can't guarantee a translator, right? So I love that I have this resource because I just spoke to someone Urdu the other day. So when you said that, I was like, yeah, there's so
And Skokie has, Skokie schools have Spanish language instruction and Urdu language instruction. So they're dual language for both of those because that is a growing population.
So basically for this parent, working with the school to help determine if the LD is separate from the language barrier.
Yes.
Is that fair? Okay.
I think that's a great summary. Yes.
Yeah.
One last question I see in the chat is in regards to outplacement. How can you make sure outplacement schools academics will be enough to get into college? How do you verify and make sure the level of academics in outplaced school alternative schools comparable to the same level at home? So my first answer, I'll answer the question I read first was, how can you make sure outplacement school academics will be enough to get into college? At the high school level, if you're outplaced but a student living in the district, the transcript that you actually will receive will be for your home school. And so that has been something I needed to clarify a number of times to different parents so they realize that transcript will be a high school transcript and it won't indicate any kind of outplacement environment. We get those grades and progress from those schools and we upload them into our transcript. So that ends up not being a barrier. But the question about the level of academics is an interesting one and I think a great one to ask. One thing you can always do is you can request to look at the school's curriculum. You can request to see what documents you can get your academic planning guide. But if a student is in an alternative outplaced setting, has already been placed and articulated a priority on the fact that there's going to be aspects of that setting that are going to take time during the school day. And so I would not be confident in answering that the rigor of the curriculum received at an outplacement is going to match the rigor that you would get at the homeschool because there just isn't space. The therapeutics placement will have time throughout the day to provide more therapeutic supports, which we've deemed as needed to then access curriculum. But we have systems for students if they're doing well in their therapeutic setting that they can come back partial day. We've done a couple of things, actually just had a small snaps with one of the teachers because we have a student who now is fully transitioned back. She's an 11th grader and she's doing great. And so that exists. I mean, you can absolutely compare the curriculum and test those questions, but just within the structure of outplacement, there's going to be differences in rigor and differences in focus. So I don't think it would be the same if you put up an AP language, syllabus for an 11th grade course and you put it next to maybe the 11th grade course that may be available at an outplaced school. And so that's like kind of a high school answer to that. It wouldn't be comparing apples to apples because the schools are structured differently to provide different supports during the school day.
Yeah, I'll add, having had a child who went through about 3.5 years in a therapeutic school, my own son, here's a couple of things to look out for. One, my first answer for this would be, the academics that a student gets is often determined by the IEP itself. So, the goals would determine the rigor if it's if they have academic goals. If they don't have academic goals and you're just looking at social emotional support or for an emotional disability, then that's a place like where Erin said you would look at matching the curriculum. So one of the things that happened when my son was in a therapeutic school was in ninth grade. So he when he went into ninth grade, they in that school, in the therapeutic school, they taught I don't remember what science it was, maybe it was biology, I think, but in freshman year at our local high school they taught physics. So the two didn't go together, and so when he ended up transferring or back to the high school, the district school, he had missed one science class and he had also missed a math class. So we ended up having to, and he did want to go to a rigorous college that required 4 years and in certain courses. So we had to find how we were going to get those. We had to navigate that. So that is something to look into. You want to make sure that everything, and you will work with your outplacement coordinator to make sure that all the boxes are checked for things like that. So he has no academic goals, only emotional support. So exactly what I just said. Make sure that it's aligned. The curriculum coordinator told me everything was aligned, and she had 30 years of experience and blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, now I have to, find a different, you can take online classes to fill those gaps. We ended up going to a private school that filled those gaps. So, which is listed on the transcript as a pass fail. And since he got A's in both and was happy about that, we had the high school counselor, it was his suggestion that he attach the grades to the transcript. So it appeared as pass fail in this other setting with no grade, and then the letter was attached. So we managed to get all 4 math and all 4 science classes in, but it was expensive and it took a lot of time and took a lot of motivation on the part of my son. So there are different ways to do that, but if I had known in 8th grade that was coming at me, I definitely would have done something different. So now you can.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Ask the questions.
I had one sent to me. Should you, if you can, have a private evaluation done before you ask for the school evaluation?
I don't know if I would say yes or no to that, because you don't need to have a private evaluation in order to request an evaluation at the school. As a school, we appreciate when we have private evaluations that come in, because we have another person's perspective, and then it can kind of guide what we look to do to test. But I wouldn't tell you that you have to in order to obtain anything, I guess is what I would say to that.
Yeah, and I think the important thing to know about that is you cannot have the same test done at the same time, or even some tests within a year's time. So if you go and have a private evaluation, the school cannot do some of the same testing. They will have to do parallel testing or alternative testing. So for example, the IQ testing, the WISC, then, one person will do it and you'll have to have coordination between the two. If the private person does it, the school can't do it and will likely just use that information. And then for academic testing, there are a myriad of different ways to test academics. So the school will probably likely do their own and the private will do their own, but they can inform each other. The obligation of the school team is to consider an outside report. The word is consider. They don't have to use it. They don't have to say, oh yeah, that's what is happening. The way I like to share this with parents is it's the equivalent to, I had a doctor do some testing on me, but now I'm taking my report from that doctor to a surgeon and I'm saying, well, that doctor said I need to have heart surgery. See, he says it right here. Now you have to do the surgery. Well, the surgeon is going to be like, no, I got to do all my own testing because I don't know what that doctor saw. I don't, that's not me. I need to make my own plan. The school is the surgeon. The school is going to be implementing, and they need to be able to collect their own data of how it works in the school setting, not in a private clinic. And look, you are talking to someone who every year was like, see what it says in my outside report, and telling the school. So I think it's great to have that information. I think it's great to get, sometimes a more in-depth look at things that the school doesn't need to test for or won't test for, just to color the situation. But, now you have all that information and you can pretty much decide how you're going to navigate that on your own. I think we answered everything.
You did it.
Look what we just did.
Well, I know we only have a few more minutes. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to send it in the chat or to any one of us. I think all the questions that come in were answered. One that came in is school refusal cause for a 504 IEP?
Ooh, that is such an interesting and timely question. As a school, we have responded to within our RTI structure to more school refusal than we ever have before, but we should be responding to it through the structure. But one of the interesting and complex things about school refusal is a lot of the school level accommodations are only impactful if you're in the school. And so a lot of our RTI, like, yes, I can have a tutoring center that's available to all students, but if you're not coming into the building, then you can't access that intervention. But schools are required to go through and try all those interventions before we move you up to tier 3. And that seems like a long and agonizing process, I know, for some families that I've worked with really closely, because we're struggling just to get students in the building. If we got to the point where we have talked with you and tried things, and we've had counselors go out to cars to try to help kids walk in, we've done all sorts of interventions and tried between tier 1 and tier 3. It does warrant a conversation about a tier 3 plan, in my opinion, and in the way that we've operated, because then what we need to acknowledge is there's something significantly impacting that student having access to the general education curriculum. In the last 2 years, I will say most of it is social emotional. And so we need to be able to figure out what supports we can put in place with our social emotional structure. So small groups. We had a little small school refusal group that became super tight knit because they realized they weren't the only ones who had anxiety coming into the door. And so we were able to structure, or we had that little group at the very beginning of the day. So it was a smidge like a soft start. That was us being really innovative on how we could in that area kind of help this particular need. And schools are having to be pretty innovative when it comes to school refusal, because we are seeing more of it in a more prevalent way. And a couple of the local hospitals, I've reached out to people because they used to have school refusal programs and I don't see them anymore. So I feel like I have barriers on even where I can refer and work with parents to get into outside therapy as well, or outside resources when it comes to that. But it could get there. And if the interventions aren't working, it should, and we should start asking those questions.
Yeah, and I would say it depends on the frequency and intensity of the refusal. So, there are different levels to that, and everybody's different, and everybody's going to respond different. So depending on what the need is, that's how school teams should respond. Look, like what Erin said, if somebody, if the school refusal is such that a soft start, which is a great idea, and a group, and that works for that kid, why would you put them in a therapeutic school, which would be the highest level of support? If they don't have to be in a therapeutic school, which is going to keep them for a minimum of a year, if not multiple years, why would you go to that? You want to exhaust services and supports that the school has, unless it is clear as day that this is just not like that, there are some serious issues. And then I wouldn't mess around with trying to soft start it or whatever. But, you just have to look at it in terms of frequency, intensity, and severity.
Great. Well, I think that was all the questions. Thank you so very much. We will be sending out the recording to everyone that was registered, which has both of your contacts information in it. Any closing words?
No, I would thank everyone who logged in, even taking a step to log into something like this. I, as a school official, appreciate that, because the more we can all talk about the topics and have our questions ready and feel like we're heard, I love it. So the shout out to all of you who logged in to hear a little bit more.
And if you don't live in Erin's district, I think you should move there, because as a school person, she is, that's who you want to work with. Her collaboration is pretty high level, so it's awesome.
Oh,
Thank you both. Thank you both. Thank you to everyone who logged on. And our next group presentation is in person, February 28th, with an author, Gina Graham, and it's about body image and disordered eating issues. So, and that is a live one in Downers Grove. So look for information on that. Thank you very, very much for everyone's time. We so appreciate it. Have a good night.
Have a good
Night.
night, everybody.